Nobody expected how far they would go this time. One evening, a resident received a shocking notice claiming a serious violation on their property. No explanation, no warning, just a threat to disconnect their power immediately. The homeowner was confused. There was no violation on their side. Everything was maintained properly, and all dues were paid on time. Still, the HOA insisted they were in breach of rules and scheduled a power cutoff within 24 hours. Neighbors started whispering. Some believed the HOA must have made a mistake, while others were afraid to speak up. The tension in the community began to rise as the deadline approached. The next day, a utility truck arrived outside the house. Workers prepared to disconnect the electricity while the homeowner stood calmly on the porch, asking for proof of the violation. But the HOA representative refused to listen. What they didn't know was that the homeowner had already gathered evidence. Emails, approvals, and legal documents showing full compliance with every rule they claimed was broken. Just as the workers were about to proceed, the homeowner made a phone call. Within minutes, the situation flipped completely. The HOA's claim was exposed as false and unauthorized. The workers stopped immediately. Even the HOA representative began to panic as higher authorities confirmed there was no valid order for disconnection. Neighbors gathered outside, watching the scene unfold. The same HOA that tried to intimidate the homeowner was now under investigation for misuse of authority. In the end, the power was never cut. Instead, it was the HOA that faced consequences for their false accusation. The homeowner stood victorious, not through aggression but through proof and patience. The HOA had always acted like they controlled every corner of the neighborhood, but this time their decision felt personal. The notice wasn't just a warning, it was a direct attack on one homeowner who had always questioned their authority. What started as a simple accusation quickly turned into a full-blown conflict. The homeowner kept asking for clarity, but every request was ignored. The HOA board had already made up its mind, even without proper investigation. As rumors spread, the neighborhood became divided. Some residents feared standing up to the HOA, while others quietly supported the homeowner but stayed silent to avoid trouble. Behind the scenes, something wasn't adding up. The documents the HOA claimed to rely on didn't match the property record. There were gaps, missing approvals, and suspicious signatures that raised serious questions. The homeowner didn't argue anymore. Instead, they began collecting every piece of proof: emails, permits, timestamps, and even recorded conversations that showed contradictions in the HOA's claims. When the confrontation day arrived, the atmosphere felt heavy. The HOA arrived with confidence, expecting compliance. But what they walked into was not resistance, it was preparation. One by one, the homeowner presented evidence that completely dismantled the accusation. Every claim the HOA made was answered with undeniable proof. For the first time, silence fell over the HOA representative. Their confidence slowly turned into confusion, then discomfort, as the truth became impossible to ignore. Even the neighbors who once doubted the homeowner began to realize what was really happening. This wasn't a violation, it was a misuse of authority. By the end of the day, the situation had completely reversed. The HOA was forced to step back and review their own actions under pressure from higher administration. The homeowner didn't celebrate loudly. They simply closed the door, knowing the truth had already done all the talking. The HOA had always operated like a silent authority in the neighborhood, setting rules, sending notices, and expecting obedience without question. Most residents followed without resistance, but this homeowner had never been the type to accept things blindly. That small resistance had slowly turned into tension over time. It started with minor disagreements: parking rules, fence height approvals, and landscaping restrictions. Nothing major at first, but enough for the HOA board to start viewing this house as problematic. And once that label was attached, every small detail about the property began to be watched more closely. Then came the notice that changed everything. It wasn't a warning this time, it was a direct order. The HOA claimed there was a serious violation and stated that the electricity supply would be disconnected immediately if compliance was not met. No proper explanation, no clear evidence attached, just authority written in formal language. The homeowner was stunned at first, reading the notice again and again, trying to understand what rule had actually been broken. Everything on the property was up to code. Bills were paid, maintenance was done, approvals were already on record. Nothing made sense. When the homeowner contacted the HOA for clarification, the response was cold and dismissive. They simply repeated the same line: "Violation confirmed. Action will proceed as scheduled." That was the moment it became clear this was not about rules anymore, it was about control. As the news spread across the neighborhood, people started reacting in different ways. Some residents felt uneasy, realizing that if this could happen to one house without explanation, it could happen to anyone. Others avoided involvement completely, fearing they might become the next target if they spoke up. Behind closed doors, the HOA board seemed unusually confident, as if they believed no one would challenge them. But what they didn't realize was that the homeowner had already started digging deeper into the paperwork related to the claim. What was discovered raised serious concerns. The violation notice referenced documents that didn't match official records. Approval logs were missing signatures, timestamps didn't align properly, and some of the claims appeared to be based on outdated or incorrect information. Instead of reacting emotionally, the homeowner stayed calm and started building a structured case. Every email was saved, every conversation noted, every document verified. It wasn't just defense anymore, it was preparation for exposure. The day the HOA scheduled the disconnection finally arrived. A utility vehicle parked outside the house, and workers stepped out with instructions in hand. The atmosphere was tense, almost unreal, as neighbors peeked through windows and gates, sensing something serious was about to unfold. The HOA representative stood confidently at first, expecting the homeowner to step aside. But instead of panic or resistance, they were met with calm silence and a folder full of organized evidence. The homeowner asked one simple question: "Can you show me the exact approved violation order with proper authorization?" That question alone shifted the energy in the entire scene. The HOA representative hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on their face. The documents they had brought were not as solid as they had claimed. The workers began to wait, sensing confusion in leadership. Then came the turning point. The homeowner made a single call to higher authorities, requesting a formal verification of the disconnection order. Within minutes, the response that came back changed everything. There was no valid authorization for a power cutoff. The order had either been issued incorrectly or without proper approval. That confirmation immediately stopped all action on the spot. The workers stepped back. The HOA representative tried to explain, but the damage was already done. What was supposed to be a display of authority had turned into a public exposure of misuse of power. As neighbors gathered outside, whispers spread quickly. People who had once stayed silent now openly questioned the HOA's actions. The confidence the board once had began to collapse under scrutiny. By the end of the day, the situation had completely reversed. Instead of the homeowner being punished, the HOA was now under formal review. Their procedures, decisions, and authority were being questioned at a higher level. The homeowner didn't raise their voice or celebrate in front of anyone. They simply stood in silence, knowing that truth doesn't need noise to win, it only needs proof. And from that moment on, the neighborhood was never the same again. The illusion of unchecked HOA power had been broken, and every resident now understood one thing clearly: authority without accountability doesn't last forever. The aftermath of the failed disconnection attempt didn't settle the neighborhood, it only made things more intense. What was once quiet suburban life had now turned into a place filled with questions, suspicion, and whispered conversations behind closed doors. The HOA board tried to regain control quickly. They issued a short statement claiming administrative confusion, trying to reduce what happened to a simple paperwork error. But the residents were no longer convinced by vague explanations. People started comparing notes. Old notices were pulled out, emails were rechecked, and patterns began to emerge. It wasn't just this one case. There were other questionable warnings sent to different homes in the past, always with pressure, always with urgency, and always with very little transparency. The homeowner, however, stayed focused and quiet. Instead of engaging in public arguments, they organized everything into a proper timeline. Every interaction with the HOA was documented with dates, times, and written proof. It was no longer about emotion, it was about structure and accountability. A few neighbors, who had initially stayed silent, slowly began to approach the homeowner. They admitted they had also felt pressured by the HOA before, but never had the courage to speak up. The situation had now created a ripple effect across the entire community. As pressure increased, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. They attempted to reassert authority, but the tone inside the meeting room had changed. This time, members were being questioned directly by residents who demanded clarity on rules, procedures, and enforcement actions. The same organization that once controlled the neighborhood through fear of penalties was now being forced to explain itself in front of the very people it governed. During the review, investigators began to notice inconsistencies in how violations were being recorded. Some approvals lacked proper verification, and certain enforcement actions appeared to bypass standard procedures entirely. The system was no longer looking clean. Meanwhile, the homeowner was called to provide a statement. Instead of speaking emotionally, they presented everything calmly and factually. There were no accusations, only documented evidence that spoke for itself. The turning point came when external authorities confirmed that the HOA had overstepped its legal boundaries in issuing the disconnection order. That confirmation shifted everything from internal dispute to formal investigation. Once that happened, the balance of power collapsed completely. The HOA could no longer rely on authority alone. Every decision they had made in recent months was now under review, line by line. Residents who once avoided conflict now started speaking openly at meetings. Complaints that had been ignored in the past were resurfacing with new attention. The silence that once protected the HOA was gone. The homeowner, despite being at the center of it all, never tried to take control of the situation. They simply continued cooperating with the investigation, letting facts replace argument. As days passed, disciplinary actions began to take shape. Certain board members were asked to step down temporarily while investigations continued. The structure of authority within the neighborhood started to shift. What made the biggest impact was not rebellion or confrontation, it was documentation. Every claim that had been made against the homeowner collapsed under the weight of verified records. In the end, the HOA was forced to restructure its policies under strict oversight. New rules were introduced to ensure transparency, proper approval channels, and fair notice procedures for all residents. The homeowner's house, which once stood under threat of disconnection, became a symbol of accountability in the neighborhood, not because of aggression, but because truth had been organized better than power. And long after everything settled, one lesson remained in the minds of everyone living there: authority only works when it is backed by fairness, and fairness only survives when it is backed by proof. Even after the official review began, the tension in the neighborhood didn't disappear overnight. It lingered like an uncomfortable silence, something everyone could feel but nobody fully wanted to talk about openly. The HOA board, once loud and confident in every decision, had gone unusually quiet. Emails were delayed, notices became less aggressive, and enforcement activity almost came to a pause. It was clear they were no longer operating with the same unchecked confidence as before. Behind the scenes, internal disagreements started to surface within the board itself. Some members argued that the situation had been mishandled from the beginning, while others tried to defend the decisions that led to the escalation. The unity that once made the HOA powerful was beginning to break apart. Meanwhile, the homeowners' position slowly transformed in the eyes of the neighborhood. They were no longer seen as the problem house, but rather as the turning point that exposed deeper issues. Still, the homeowner did not engage in public praise or arguments. They stayed consistent with the same calm approach. The investigation team continued reviewing records, and the deeper they went, the more inconsistencies they found. Approval workflows that were supposed to follow strict steps were often bypassed. Some notices were issued without proper cross-verification, and in certain cases, documentation appeared incomplete or retroactively adjusted. This wasn't just about one power disconnection anymore. It had become a larger question about how decisions were being made and who was actually holding authority accountable. As findings slowly became public within official channels, the HOA board was instructed to suspend certain operations until corrective measures were implemented. That suspension alone changed the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood. Residents who had previously avoided involvement started attending meetings. Not out of anger, but out of curiosity and concern. They wanted to understand how things had been allowed to reach this point without anyone noticing earlier. In one of the meetings, the homeowner was asked again to clarify their role in escalating the issue. Instead of taking credit or shifting blame, they simply explained the sequence of events as they happened, backed by documents and timestamp. There was no dramatization, only facts. That approach had a strong effect on everyone present. It made the situation feel less like a personal conflict and more like a systemic failure that needed correction. Outside the meetings, conversations among neighbors began to change tone. People started discussing transparency, approval processes, and fairness in enforcement. What was once a quiet community had started developing a more aware and questioning mindset. Eventually, formal recommendations were issued. The HOA was required to revise its enforcement policies, introduce third-party oversight for major penalties, and ensure that all future violations followed documented approval chains before any action could be taken. Several board members voluntarily stepped down, acknowledging that mistakes had been made in judgment and process. New interim members were appointed under stricter guidelines to rebuild trust. Through all of this, the homeowner's house remained untouched. But more importantly, it was no longer just a house under dispute. It had become a reference point for accountability within the neighborhood's history. In the final reflection of the case, even the investigators noted that the issue was not simply about one wrong decision, but about how easily authority can drift away from fairness when it is not consistently checked. And in the end, the neighborhood didn't just change its rules, it changed its awareness. People became more observant, more informed, and less willing to accept decisions without evidence. The story didn't end with conflict or celebration. It ended with a quiet shift in understanding that systems only stay fair when people are willing to question them, and truth becomes powerful only when it is properly recorded, not just spoken. After the official restructuring began, the neighborhood entered a strange transitional phase. Everything looked normal on the surface. Lawns were still trimmed, houses still quiet, but the underlying system that governed daily rules was no longer the same. The HOA's authority had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped. Every decision now required additional approval layers, and that slowed everything down significantly. For residents, it felt like a pause between the old way of control and a new system still trying to find balance. Some residents welcomed the change, seeing it as overdue correction. Others felt uncertain, because the strict but predictable structure they were used to had been replaced by something less familiar. The stability they once understood had turned into cautious adjustment. The homeowner, who had once been at the center of conflict, slowly returned to normal life. But things were not the same anymore. Occasional glances from neighbors carried respect instead of suspicion. Conversations that once avoided them now included them naturally. Still, the homeowner remained distant from the attention. They didn't position themselves as a leader or spokesperson. Whenever asked about the situation, they gave the same simple answer. Everything was already in the documents, nothing more needed to be added. Weeks passed, and the investigation reached its final stage. The report was extensive, covering procedures, approvals, communication gaps, and enforcement practices that had gone unchecked for years. It confirmed that the issue was not isolated, but part of a broader pattern of weak oversight. This conclusion shifted responsibility beyond just individuals. It pointed toward systemic flaws that allowed decisions to move forward without proper validation. That realization forced a complete redesign of how the HOA would operate going forward. New oversight rules were introduced. Major penalties now required external confirmation. Emergency actions needed dual authorization. And every enforcement notice had to be logged and reviewed before execution. It was no longer a closed system. As these changes rolled out, some former board members struggled with the transition. They were used to fast decisions and immediate compliance. Now, every action required justification, documentation, and review. The speed of authority had been replaced by the weight of accountability. In time, the neighborhood began to settle into this new structure. It wasn't perfect, but it was more transparent. Residents began receiving clearer notices, with explanations instead of vague warnings. Communication replaced intimidation. The homeowner's role slowly faded from active discussion, but the impact of their case remained embedded in the system. Every new procedure introduced carried traces of what had gone wrong before, as a reminder of why the changes were necessary. Even those who had once supported the HOA's strict approach admitted privately that things had gone too far in the past. The experience had changed how people viewed authority, not as something to fear, but something to understand and verify. One evening, months after everything had settled, the same street that once gathered in tension now felt calm again. Children played outside, neighbors exchanged small greetings, and life returned to its ordinary rhythm. But underneath that calm was a different awareness. People paid more attention now. They read notices carefully. They asked questions when something didn't make sense. Silence was no longer automatic acceptance, and the homeowner, standing quietly inside their house, could see that the real outcome of everything wasn't victory or defeat. It was awareness, because in the end, the biggest change wasn't in the HOA's structure, it was in the mindset of the people who lived under it. After everything had officially settled, most people expected the story to fade into neighborhood memory. But in reality, its effects kept resurfacing in small, subtle ways that reminded everyone how deeply things had changed. The HOA, now under stricter oversight, continued operating, but with a completely different tone. Meetings that once felt one-sided had turned into structured discussions. Residents were no longer passive listeners. They actively questioned, challenged, and requested clarification on decisions. Even routine notices changed in style. Instead of short, intimidating warnings, they now included explanations, reference points, and clear steps for resolution. It was a shift from authority-driven communication to accountability-based communication. However, not everyone adapted easily. Some longtime board members struggled with the new system. They felt restricted, as if every action was now slowed down by procedures they weren't used to. What they once saw as efficiency had now been replaced by oversight and documentation. This internal resistance created quiet friction within the organization. Meetings occasionally turned tense, not because of conflict with residents, but because of disagreement about how much control the HOA should actually have. Meanwhile, the homeowner's life continued in a surprisingly normal way. The dramatic phase had ended, but occasional reminders still appeared, neighbors referencing the case in conversations or newer residents asking what really happened. The homeowner never exaggerated the story. They never turned it into a personal achievement or public identity. Instead, they treated it like a closed chapter. Something that happened, was resolved, and should now serve as reference, not drama. Over time, even those who were once critical of the homeowner began to see the situation differently. It wasn't about one person winning against the HOA. It was about a system being forced to correct itself after losing transparency. As months passed, the neighborhood gradually developed a new normal. Not silent obedience, but informed participation. People began to understand that rules were not just instructions, they were processes that could and should be examined. The HOA also started introducing periodic audit. Independent reviewers were brought in to check whether enforcement actions matched policy. This added another layer of accountability that had never existed before. What stood out most during these changes was how behavior itself shifted. Residents became more aware of documentation, more careful with communication, and more engaged in community decisions. The fear of questioning authority had largely disappeared. And yet, despite all these structural changes, the most important transformation remained invisible on paper. Trust was no longer automatic, it had to be earned continuously. One evening, during a quiet community meeting, someone mentioned the past incident again, not in anger, but as a reminder of why transparency mattered now. The room didn't react with tension, but with understanding. Even the HOA representatives acknowledged it indirectly. They didn't revisit blame. Instead, they focused on prevention, improvement, and consistency moving forward. The homeowner, sitting quietly in that same meeting, listened without speaking. There was no need to re-explain or relive anything. The outcome had already spoken for itself through the system changes. And as time continued, the story slowly transformed from a conflict into a lesson embedded in the neighborhood's structure. Not a legend, not a victory tale, but a reminder that systems only improve when pressure forces them to become honest.